there's a meeting today in Germany, in Ramstein, of all the defense leaders of Ukraine's allies, and we'll see whether Germany is able to withstand the pressure during that meeting. Its Chancellor Scholz did at Davos, refused to give that commitment to ship tanks. But I think, for all of us who might have been falling into the complacency that Putin had lost this war, it was kind of all over. The worst that might happen would be that it was be a long, cold sort of de facto peace, even if he wouldn't formally acknowledge he'd lost. I think that complacency has been punctured because Ukraine has two big vulnerabilities. The first is it needs a really stable peace agreement if it's to attract the reconstruction funds it needs, particularly private sector funds. And that will only come, people have concluded, if Putin absolutely has no choice but to recognize he's lost. And that in turn will only happen if Ukraine is armed for a more offensive rather than defensive war. And that means not just tanks, but also longer range missiles. And so that was very much on the minds of the sort of security figures at Davos. On the minds of the finance officials was the sheer scale of the economic reconstruction bill for a war which has seen a sort of 20th century war, but used in 21st century weapons and targeting civilian infrastructure. The damage assessment made by the World Bank and EU is of $350 billion. That is a huge number. And there is a sense nobody's got any idea yet where that's coming from. The sort of best but highly controversial idea is take it from Russian international central bank reserves, but that risks, blowing a hole in the whole system of international financial reserves and their integrity and the international protection of them, of sovereign funds. So, this double whammy of needing to help Ukraine go on the offensive and needing to mobilize subsequently and even already huge amounts for its reconstruction, I think it left people gloomier about Ukraine than they were going into the meetings, despite remarkable Ukrainian figures, human rights champions, Nobel Peace Prize winner, who my foundation has been proud enough to support for many years in her human rights work, Mrs. Zelensky, the Catholic Archbishop of Ukraine, the extraordinary array of Ukrainians making an eloquent case for their country in Davos this week.
Do you think that the UK involvement in Ukraine is right now? You talk about it needing to be an offensive war in order for Ukraine to succeed. We know, front of the Times today reporting that 600 Brimstone missiles are being supplied from Britain. Is the right stuff being given to Ukraine right now?
I think we're getting there. I think the problem, and certainly the Ukrainians argue this, is everybody's always kind of half a step behind what's needed because, there's been a real reluctance to turn this into a war which goes into or risks going into Russian territory in a big way. Just for a fear of escalation and of it triggering some kind of nuclear response from Putin. And so, the sort of caution around the Western response, the limits on it, have constrained the Ukrainians, who now face this massive Russian mobilization of a couple of hundred thousand, maybe a million conscripts, being deployed, untrained, cannon fodder in the worst kind of way, but nevertheless with some risk that they might overwhelm Ukraine through sheer numbers. In that, situation, in a sense, Western strategy has to sort of grip the nettle here and risk a more offensive war than politically is deemed wise. And I think everybody, the UK, the US, NATO as a whole, has struggled with this. But I think, listening to the NATO Secretary General in Davos this week, I think everybody's getting very close to gripping the nettle and recognizing they've got to step up support in a much more offensive way to Ukraine.
Of course, there is concern, isn't there, that so much is being given to Ukraine by the British Army. There's not enough left, and it could leave us exposed. Do you think that's valid?
Well, I mean, I think, this is a bonanza for defense industries because supply chains, which have been, under cobwebs for years, are kind of getting reactivated, or production lines rather. And, a lot of material is going to have to be built quickly. But I think, the Polish president, made the argument that, he was happy to see his tanks and equipment go to Ukraine, because if Ukraine was overrun, he became the new front line, and he'd then have to take on the fight directly himself with the Russians, and his people would. And I think, in the same way that argument goes for the UK and the rest of NATO, this is becoming, a fight for Europe. And if Ukraine were to be lost, and I think it won't be, but were it to be lost, NATO as a whole is at risk. So, yes, there's a risk of depleting British supplies, but the price of not depleting British supplies is a war which may get much closer to us.